Good morning or good afternoon to those of you who are coming into the call right now. We're going to give this a couple of minutes to load all the attendees. We have over 600 registrations today, so we want to give 2 or 3 minutes for people to get on this call. So if you'll just be patient with us, we'll be starting the webinar shortly. We'll be getting started in just 1 minute. We're going to give just a few more seconds for people to get on the line, and then we will get this webinar started. Thank you for your patience. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third WITA webinar. My name is Ken Levinson. I'm the Executive Director of WITA, and I'm coming to you from Bethesda, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. We hope you are all well, and we're glad to be able to be with you today virtually. This is our third webinar, as I said, discussing COVID-19 and trade. And of course, I just want to mention today and this weekend mark 2 important religious holidays. In the spirit of Passover, which started last night, I think I speak for everyone in expressing our hope that this period of coronavirus passes over us quickly. And to our Christian friends, rejoice, Easter is coming. We look forward to a time when we're all able to commune together when it's safe to do so. At WITA, we'd like to be the place that puts community and trade community, and we hope that this virtual gathering provides some sense of community while we can't gather in person. We'll continue to try to do these webinars every Thursday at 11 a.m. US Eastern during this period of physical distancing. And next week, we will focus on the proliferation of export restrictions that have begun to emerge. You should have seen the registration information in the email we sent out this morning. If you have any trouble with your connection today, you can always go to WITA's YouTube page and watch the event live there. After the panelists' remarks and a brief discussion, we'll try to answer some audience questions. If you're watching this on Zoom, you have the ability to ask questions using the Q&A box that's located on the bottom of your screen. With over 600 people expected on this webinar, we are unable to have all of you on live audio and video, but we will try to get to as many questions as we can. We're delighted to be joined today by an amazing panel, including my co-host in this series of webinars, Wendy Cutler, the Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute, and Ambassador Darcy Vetter, the former Chief Agriculture Negotiator at the U.S. Trade Representative and Deputy Undersecretary at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Darcy coordinates Edelman's North American food and beverage practice and is a member of WITA's board. She'll be moderating today's discussion and will introduce our panelists, Sabine Weyand, the Director General for Trade of the European Community, and my old friend and mentor, Alan Wolf, the Deputy Director General at the WTO, who was kind enough to join us for our first of these sessions 2 weeks ago. Welcome back, Alan. After the panelists' remarks and any discussion among our panelists, we'll turn to questions. Turn it over now to Darcy.
Thank you very much, Ken, and thanks to everyone for joining us this morning here in Washington, D.C., but afternoon or evening, perhaps, for colleagues in Europe and in other places around the globe. We're so happy to have you. As Ken mentioned, we have an amazing panel full of trade and economic policy veterans this morning, We'll briefly mention each of them, but their full bios should be available for you in the announcement for the webinar today. Again, we have Sabine Weyand, the Director General for Trade for the European Commission, Ambassador Alan Wolf, the Deputy Director General of the WTO, and Wendy Cutler, the Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute and former Acting Deputy U.S. Trade Representative. I'm just going to start right away with questions for each of the panelists. We'll do a couple of rounds of those in discussion, and then we'll bring in your questions from the audience. As Ken noted, Wendy is really co-hosting with us this series of webinars. And so Wendy, I thought you could start by helping us set the stage today. First, could you give us a sort of 1 or 2 sentence recap of our previous conversations in the webinar series, but also tell us a bit how the trade and coronavirus or trade and COVID conversation has really evolved, what events have changed over this past week?
Well, thanks, Darcy, and thanks, Ken, and I hope all our viewers, everyone's safe and healthy. I'm going to be brief because I know people are very anxious to hear our other 2 speakers. I thought I would highlight just 2 important developments on the COVID trade front over the past week. I'm sure our speakers will probably go into these issues, these topics in a little more detail. But number 1, the WTO trade forecast was issued yesterday. I think we'll all agree that it's pretty sobering. The WTO provides a range of the decrease in trade for 2020 between 13% drop to a 32% drop, both double digits. And the Director General Azevedo said, it's unclear where we're going to land in that range, but a lot will depend on 2 things. First, the duration of the pandemic, but second, the policy choices that countries make. And here then I want to transition to the other key development, the policy choices. And I think what Azevedo is getting to is that a lot will depend on whether countries use the pandemic as an opportunity to dismantle barriers or as an occasion to really erect more barriers. And particularly with respect to export restrictions, we're continuing to see a proliferation of export curbs on medical equipment and supplies, but also on medicines and food. And over this past week, the US now has joined the group of the 70 so countries. It kind of unfolded this week first as kind of a company specific back and forth between the administration and the company 3M. There was some discussion of whether 3M would be allowed to keep exporting to Canada and to Latin America. I think the Prime Minister Trudeau and his senior colleagues kind of made it very clear to the administration that the United States is dependent on Canada for the input of pulp for a lot of these medical supplies, but also Canada supplies nurses, which are urgently needed in northern United States. So in any event, common ground was found and both sides found an accommodation, but this was then quickly followed by a rule put out by FEMA just yesterday, which basically imposes US export restrictions on masks, including surgical masks and respirator masks, as well as gloves. It doesn't appear to be an outright ban. It talks more about how exports will stay at the border until FEMA and CBP decide whether to let them go or to redirect them domestically. And so the jury's still out on how these export restrictions will be applied. Will they be applied in a very strict, restrictive manner, or will they be implemented more liberally? Before leaving this category, I just wanted to say that if one country kind of gets the award on export restrictions this week, I would give it to Turkey, because they found an export restriction which intersects both with food and with medical, and that is their export restriction on lemons. Because I've learned this past week that lemon juice is an important ingredient apparently for disinfectants. We're also seeing on the positive side tariff either suspension or elimination continuing with respect to some key medical products. And I would just point here that the WTO did a really useful report on trade and medical goods, which was issued this past week, which really provides a lot of important data on the tariff rates of countries in these areas, including medical equipment, PPE, medical devices, and medicines. And I would just say here, what it underscored for me is that most countries, or at least the large countries, are both importers and exporters of this equipment and supplies. And so therefore, if you're going to restrict your exports, it's hard then to count on other countries to be very open with providing you the imports that you need. We're kind of all in this together. So I wanted to conclude with just two kind of policy recommendations for going forward, and then I will cede my time. And that is, number one, I think this all again underscores the need and urgency once we get around, we turn the corner on COVID, for some kind of sectoral barrier-free initiative on medical equipment, supplies, and medicines. I think the time is right for this. I think it's good for the WTO. It looked relevant. I think everyone now recognizes the importance of these goods and supplies. And it also helps us all work together to prepare for another pandemic. And second, I think it's really, there's an opportunity now for the WTO or smaller groups of countries to really elaborate on the types of disciplines that should be applied on export restrictions. The G20 issued kind of 4 principles that should be adhered to with respect to export restrictions: temporary, transparent, targeted, and proportional. The WTO and WCO this past week also added on the principle of non-discrimination. And I think this is an area which really could use some more work, and that is really elaborating, what does temporary mean? Does this mean there should be a sunset provision? Does this mean a specific number of days? Should this be tied to the discovery of a vaccine on the pandemic, et cetera? But I think there is useful work that could be done here, ideally by the WTO, but if not, maybe a group of interested countries, and then over time, they can invite more countries on board. And I would conclude in just giving the US Chamber of Commerce kind of a shout out here, because they have put forward their thoughts on some of the elaboration that could be provided with respect to these principles. So thank you very much. And back to you, Darcy, and to our other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. I think that was an excellent overview of developments, but also principles to keep in mind during our discussion today. And I would note, as you said, in the case of medical equipment and supplies, where most countries are both importers and exporters, that of course applies to food as well, where most countries are both importers and exporters of necessary products for food and nutrition. Good principles to keep in mind on that front as well. Playing off of that excellent summary, Sabine, I think I'd like to turn next to you. And we know that both member states and the Commission have taken some measures on trade related to managing COVID, and wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about the measures themselves, or key measures that have been taken, but that overall approach and how the Commission is trying to apply some of those principles, or think about what principles they had in mind when they developed those measures, and how that influenced their structure.
Thank you very much. And from Brussels, it's good afternoon. So I'm very happy to be able to participate at a distance in this panel. And I think Wendy and you, Darcy, have already set the scene very well for us. I think it's quite interesting also from a US perspective to look at what the EU has been doing so far, because we are several weeks ahead in terms of the infection curve. So I think it's probably interesting to see how we have been faring so far. Now, I think we need to look at this crisis, which is a double crisis, a health crisis, first of all, a pandemic, and then an economic one, as a sequence of different steps. And they all require different public policy responses and also different trade policy responses. We are still in the heat of the pandemic, in a lockdown situation where the main objective is to flatten the curve. The lockdown measures, the physical distancing measures are beginning to show results, but it's too early to lift them. We still haven't reduced the infection rates enough. So at this stage, public policy is very much focused at both member state level and the EU level at providing the essential services in terms of healthcare, ensuring supply of essential goods and services, utilities, etc. And that's very much what we have been focusing on. What does that mean for trade policy? Now, as countries are confronted with sudden outbursts of infection, very often localized first, then spreading further, they've all scrambled to take action. And in order to secure the necessary supplies, because we are confronted with a global shortage of personal protective equipment, medical devices, pharmaceuticals, active pharmaceutical ingredients, etc. In such a situation, we saw that some member states started to introduce outright export bans. And that is when we sprang into action and said, no, I mean, export bans reduce the availability and drive up the costs for everybody. So what we need to do is to make sure that we direct the scarce resources to where the needs are greatest, which is in the health sector and in the social care sector, while we are ramping up production. And we need to ramp up production globally. To give you just one example, a ventilator, which is one of the most sought after and most scarce products in this crisis, consists of, depending on how sophisticated it is, 600 and 900 individual components. These are sourced from all over the world. Self-sufficiency is not an option for any country. It's not an option even for any continent. And I think that is how we need to think about the measures we are taking. So what we did is we talked to the member states and said, okay, we need to make sure that first of all, we do not have barriers inside the internal market of the EU so that goods can move freely there. But we are ready to introduce measures, an export authorization regime, which we introduced for 6 weeks. The current measure will expire on the 25th of April. It only concerns personal protective equipment, and it is not an export ban, but it basically means that we can channel what we have in the EU towards the medical sector, the healthcare and the social sector inside the EU, but also outside the EU. So we encourage member states to grant these authorizations if they go to humanitarian assistance and if they serve government agencies procuring them in third countries to service the health sector. And what we have seen is that these export authorizations are being granted. We are at the same time, we have stepped up indeed the buying, the production and the buying of this material through joint procurement, because that means we have a bigger amount of money to play with and a bigger demand. So hopefully a better chance to procure these things. And now we are reviewing these measures. We will probably reduce their scope further because not all PPE is really that scarce. So we will reduce that in line with evidence of scarcity. We will exempt humanitarian organizations that are recognized partners in fighting humanitarian crises. It will again be strictly time limited. So this is the proposal that we will send to the member states next week. That is the way we live up to the commitment we've been pushing in the G20. So the reference to these measures being targeted, transparent, temporary, and proportionate is something that was very much inspired by language we proposed. And that is exactly what we want to live up to. But we have to recognize that in the heat of a crisis, you cannot leave the allocation of scarce resources just to the markets. You have to accept that you have to be able to direct it towards the health sector rather than allow speculators to buy up what they can find on the market. We very much share the notion that we absolutely have to keep supply chains open. And that is what we are engaged in with other trading partners. Also, we need to fight restrictions in the food sector because there is no shortage of agri-food. Unlike protective material in the crisis where there is a global scarcity, in the food sector, we do not have shortages. So we really have to fight against restrictions there, which could lead to such shortages in the near future. So we really have to try and get rid of that. But that is the response for the immediate term. Then we have to look at what is the trade policy response that is required for the economic recovery, which we'll hopefully see as we gradually move out of the lockdown situation. And obviously what we are doing now will set the stage for how we will be able to get out of the crisis. And here I'm worried when I see that the crisis, both the health and the economic one, reinforces three mega trends, which are very negative for the world, I would argue. One is the increasing role of the state in the economy. We've already seen that with the proliferation of managed trade agreements. We are now at risk of seeing this morph into managed economy. And while, as I said, in an immediate health crisis where we have almost a wartime economy model, it is understandable that the state takes more of a role. This is not a sustainable long-term situation. So we need to see how we can move back from this sort of wartime economic model to market-oriented conditions. The second mega trend that is being reinforced is the decoupling that we have already seen between the US and China from a technology angle. We all are aware of the 5G debate. But now we are seeing the disruption of supply chains as countries seem to strive for self-sufficiency in medical equipment. So I think that is very negative and would increase the cost of the economic recovery for everyone. And the third trend that we have seen already before is the undermining of global governance, the weakening of institutions like the WTO, but also others. And we badly need them in order to coordinate the effort. Just like Wendy said, we really need to find a way to give a new boost to liberalization, market liberalization initiatives. We have already on the EU side suspended unilaterally tariffs and VAT on COVID-related equipment as a short-term emergency measure. We will discuss, Commissioner Hogan will discuss with his counterparts from the member states in a video conference next week, an initiative to make the elimination of tariffs more permanent, leading up to a negotiation in the WTO, we would hope. But we also need to look at how we can get out of the crisis through more rulemaking that ensures a level playing field between actors. If I look, for instance, now at the massive state money that is being pumped into the economy for very good reasons, short-term now in order to keep people in employment, to maintain the economic fabric of our societies. In the medium term, as we see the recovery, there will be a huge fiscal stimulus. But at some stage, we also have to come together and wean off people again from this massive state support, which otherwise risks undermining the level playing field in the global economy and drive up costs of recovery for everybody. So this is something where we want to pursue negotiations on updating the WTO rulebook. And I think this is very urgent. To all this, there is clearly a multilateral dimension, and I will in a moment cede the floor to Alan to develop that. But I just wanted to say as a last remark, there is obviously also a transatlantic dimension to this. I think that the US and the EU have a particular responsibility to ensure that we make the exit from this crisis and the economic recovery as painless as possible. It will be painful enough in any case. But I think we need to work together and set an example by doing away with our trade irritants. And I give you just one example, Airbus Boeing. Before the crisis erupted, I think we had managed to start engaging the US in a constructive discussion about the elimination of tariffs. The elimination of subsidies. This will become, in a way, more urgent, but at the same time more difficult. We have, of course, seen that there are 17 billion waiting to be disbursed to Boeing. But I think at the same time, it should also impress on both sides the urgency of coming to an agreement so that we can focus on creating a level playing field also in the aircraft sector for the future. So as we are all grappling with our immediate urgency measures, we need to keep in mind that now we are setting the tone and setting the stage for how we will all be able to come out of the crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sabine. I think that was, we covered a lot of ground from now and moving into later, and how you're approaching that as the Commission. I think that was very helpful. If I can go back briefly to what you were talking about in the current measures that member states and the Commission have undertaken as they relate to medical supplies. You mentioned that the Commission would be introducing an update to some of those policies or reform to them that would allow for easier export of some of those products. Does that apply both to supplies and to medicines themselves? Is that across the board for products? How might that reform proposal, what would it encompass?
The original measure was only covered personal protection equipment, essentially masks and gloves. What we are seeing now, and surgical gowns, etc., that sort of stuff. We didn't introduce export measures relating to medical equipment, and we've been working with member states that had started introducing them to lift them. That's not yet 100% achieved, but we are making steady progress, and we keep insisting on member states lifting these measures. So we are not in the business of introducing export authorization regimes beyond the area of PPE. And inside PPE, we are about to reduce the scope further, because we had introduced a 6-week emergency measure in the middle of the crisis without too much evidence. Now that we have moved towards joint procurement, towards a coordination of demand and supply with member states, we are beginning to have a better view of the availability of these different materials. And so we will further restrict the product scope. And as I said, in terms of, we will also facilitate by exempting exports that go to recognized humanitarian organizations. So we've been monitoring how member states have applied this. We have also notified our measures to the WTO, because we want the WTO to play this role of monitoring trade policy. The WTO is the right place to do that, and they are much better placed and much more legitimate to do it and hold member states members of the WTO to account than our think tanks, although we all appreciate the work that has been done by think tanks, but I think the WTO has to play its role in this respect, and we will certainly support it in doing so.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Alan, I'd like to turn to you. Wendy noted in her remarks the WTO's recent forecast, and sobering it was, on the forecast for trade flows in this next year. You also just published a paper recently outlining a number of different recommendations for ways that the international trade rules could be used to help address critical shortages due to COVID-19. And Wendy mentioned a few of those, as did Sabine, everything from eliminating tariffs on essential supplies, expediting customs procedures, the use of subsidies to generate additional production of medical necessities. Which of these measures do you see across the board, not just in the US and the EU, being used most, and why? Which frankly, those recommendations are being ignored. And then how can the WTO and other institutions exert some influence about how countries might be using those measures together or coordinating them.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for WITA putting together this series. It was envisaged at a time when it would have been important in any event. Now it's essential and a great public service, and I'm very happy to join it. I much appreciate the remarks made in introduction by Wendy and the Darcy, and the comprehensive overview given by Sabina. There is a triage that has to take place, namely, our first priority is dealing with the health crisis. The second priority will be what can be done on the trade side with respect to recovery. And then down the road, it is how to make the institution more effective, make it work better. The beginning of this is two reports Wendy cited by the WTO, that medical devices are some $2 trillion of imports and exports in world trade, so nothing small. And a third of them are in short supply, being under a great deal of pressure of demand. Tariffs on some are very high and still are high, on even things like soap. I mean, the CDC and others, the epidemiologists recommend that everyone use a lot of soap, and tariffs by some members are on average 17% and in some places 65%, which makes no sense whatsoever. Taxing the tools one needs to deal with the crisis is certainly not a good policy. As was pointed out by Sabina, the measures that are being put into place, the additional measures on export controls, are harmful with respect to products like ventilators or personal protective equipment, medicines. They are even less logical with respect to food, as has been said. We're on track to have food supplies of cereals at the highest, the third highest on record since statistics have been kept. And we're in much better shape globally than we were in the financial crisis in terms of the capability and availability of food. The trade forecast was the second report out, and that came out yesterday. As Wendy said, there's a range, 13% to a 32% drop off in 2020 of trade, which is the largest decline on record at the extreme. Double-digit declines for every region. This is much greater decline than was in the financial crisis. The estimates are very positive for 2021. That depends entirely on the course of the disease, the infection rate, and trade policy measures that are put into place. I might say there was an article in the New York Times this morning that quoted a National Academy's report that said, in the last 250 years, every influenza outbreak, every pandemic has been followed by a second wave. If that happens with this, and no one knows, then we're into late 2021 or 2022 for the hoped for major part of the upswing. So we have to prepare for that. What's behind the statistics is that the costs of trade have gone up dramatically. They're up by 25%, is the estimate of our economists. 25% increase in costs of moving something from farm or factory across a border. And that makes profit margins, which for retail may be well under 5%, could be 1%. For online retail, it's even less than that. This is a massive increase in the cost of goods. Someone has to pay that. And it'll have to be either the producers, who only have a certain amount of flexibility, or the consumers, who partially are not in the market and are struggling with incomes in in all countries, some more than others, depending on the social safety net. There are some positives. The schedules of bound tariffs are in place and are largely honored, not entirely, but they're there. There's an agreement on pharmaceuticals that has been updated 3 times for 0 tariffs on pharmaceuticals, which was last updated in 2011. So there's a lot of new medications that come along since then. So that should get attention, but there's a way to do it. The information technology agreement, which is crucial to both the fighting of the corona virus and the functioning of the world economy in virtual ways. The information technology agreement was supposed to be reviewed in 2018. Didn't happen. It's now even more important that it does happen and that the coverage is extended. Help with respect to another positive is there's a sanitary and phytosanitary agreement that standards are to be on scientific basis. There's a standards code. The technical barriers to trade agreement is in place. And we have seen, as we mentioned, a number of countries, including the EU, and 7 countries starting with New Zealand and Singapore, to put into place positive responses. In terms of the ideas on what can be done, every country is entirely capable of removing tariffs on particularly medical goods. And they have the pharmaceutical agreement, they have the ITA, the information technology agreement as precedents. So for the immediate health issue, fighting the coronavirus, taking off the tariffs is certainly doable, should be coordinated, and the WTO is the place to do that. Export restrictions, it's going to be difficult because a country has to explain to its people, as Sabina just did, that it's counterproductive to try to keep everything at home, to hoard supplies, because you need supplies from every place. And there could be a competitive application of supply restrictions that would be very destructive. There have been a lot of suggestions from think tanks, including the Center for Strategic and International Studies, suggested a WTO crisis committee. We don't operate on think tank suggestions, unfortunately, or fortunately, as the case may be. We need members to come forward and say, this is what we want to do now. There is a lot of discussion among the members as to what they want to do. We expect proposals to be coming in. There's a business consultative mechanism with the International Chamber of Commerce that has been set up with the Director General. But the output of that really has to be to members, that the individual chambers of commerce have to go to their governments and say, in the WTO, this is what we'd like to have you do. And that is what will make a difference. There are a lot of knock-on problems. Trying to fight the coronavirus means that there are labor shortages, and that can affect plantings for agriculture. It can affect harvesting in agriculture. It certainly affects production of goods. So there's a supply shock. And if you read the morning papers, there's now a demand shock as well, where China is coming back online and ships are starting to come towards the United States and elsewhere. And there is very little demand. So ships are taking longer routes to try to work with the supply chain problems. We have to get the economy started again. And for that, trade ministers really have only a few tools. They have the tariffs, which they can remove, best done at least in parallel. I fear that a negotiation would take longer than we need, but could be a negotiation. But removal of tariffs, the one fiscal policy that the trade ministers have. Secondly, trade facilitation, helping the developing countries really make the trade facilitation work. There's a lot of differential in that regard. Services, when passenger traffic stopped on airlines, actually what's underneath the plane also stopped. And that means that high-end crops, specialty crops, cut flowers, vegetables from Africa into Europe, from Latin America into the US, that's a severe adverse effect on the producers in those countries. And the labor shortages are global. In not every country, but every region, Asia, Latin America, North America, Europe, Africa, have labor problems because of borders being closed and because of sheltering in place. So there's a lot to be done. There have been recommendations from the services associations and working together, 8 regional services organizations putting together a joint series of proposals that members would have to take up. And we're on the cusp of that happening. I'm very pleased to hear that Commissioner Hogan is working with the member states, and I hope that that will result in proposals in Geneva from the EU, and that I know that other countries, other members are actively considering what should be done. We'll get around to WTO reform down the road, and we will learn, I think, from our current experiences, as well as the 25 years the WTO has had, of areas that really, really require improvement in negotiation, primarily, improvement in decision-making and governance, and improvement in dispute settlement. So there's a very large agenda, and private sector has a major role to play, but it's largely going to be through governments that it can be effective. So I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thank you very much, Alan. I think it's a good reminder that there are a lot of tools at your disposal, but the WTO also needs member states to step forward and really start that process. The WTO can't act on its own. I think you've also provided a good reminder of how any stickiness in our trade system, where supply chains find a shock in one place, has an impact on others, whether that's the cargo underneath passengers, movement of laborers, and how that reverberates throughout our supply chain. And so where we can use trade rules and trade measures to keep things moving as much as is possible while protecting public health, that will have a real impact on the economic recovery as well. So point very well taken. I know there are a number of folks who have questions, and so I do want to move to those questions in just a moment, but wanted to turn to you, Wendy, before we move to audience questions. You've been a trade negotiator for a long time, as have Sabine and Alan, and you've seen a lot of challenges to the trading system. But I think today's discussion was in part a recap of how these different shocks to the system are impacting one another and providing overall challenges to our trade relationships and to our international economic institutions. But it seems like at this particular point in time, those institutions are weaker than they have been, or have not been quite up to the task to deliver clear guidance and to show clear commonality of initiative. And I wonder if you might comment to wrap up this discussion before we go to the questions. do you think they can still play that useful role and do so in a way that is fast enough to really steer us back toward recovery and handling the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, this is a time when we really need a collective international response to a global pandemic, but it comes at a time, as you said, when a lot of these international economic institutions are quite weak. And in the process, even before the pandemic, they were trying to kind of reinvent themselves and update themselves. So, you know, it is discouraging, and reading some of these statements that are coming out from these organizations, particularly the G20, I found disappointing. You know, there's a vacuum in leadership for sure. The US is not playing the leading role here. I think the US-China tensions have also affected the operation of these institutions. As we've discussed this morning, and I think Sabine made a great point when it comes to health emergencies, you know, when the emergency hits, it's your domestics, your national citizens first. That's who you think about, and rightly so. And again, you know, institutions like the WTO were, you know, experiencing difficulties even before this. So yeah, I mean, you can be very pessimistic about this. I think the way I look at it is that, look, it's still playing out. I think it's too early to sign off these institutions, but I think we need to lower our expectations and maybe kind of build from the bottom. And I think something Alan said is critical, that at the end of the day, the institutions are made up of countries. And, you know, you look at the WTO, how many years was I, you know, in the seat saying the WTO is a member-driven organization. So the members need to step up to the plate. If the United States isn't going to do that, then other countries need to. And, you know, not to put any pressure on some medium-sized countries, but we have seen, you know, the important initiative by New Zealand and Singapore. So maybe in some of these initiatives, it's other groups or countries on an ad hoc basis that need to come together and kind of drive the process, and over time bring other countries on board if indeed the big countries are not, you know, in that leadership position.
Thank you, Wendy. Ken, I think you've had your eye on the questions coming in from the audience, and so we'll turn it to you if there are some you'd like to pull out and pose to the panel.
Yes. Thank you, Darcy, and thanks, panelists, for your remarks. As I mentioned to folks earlier, please use the Q&A function on your screen. This is for the attendees to post your questions. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Based on our experience from past weeks, please try to keep your questions short and tell us who they're directed towards, and we can try to get to as many as we can. I think the first question that came in is one that Wendy touched on briefly, but Sabine, I think it goes to the question of a plurilateral negotiation on medical goods. And do you see that as something that the European Union would want to take part in or possibly lead, whether or not the United States had a leadership role in such an initiative?
Thank you very much for that question. Now, this is indeed something we've obviously been discussing, because, as I said, we've also taken emergency relief action and suspended tariff duties. But given that our tariff duties on these products are already either zero MFN or very low, there was not much to be gained, which is why we also went for a suspension of VAT, which makes more of an impact. But that is just looking, and many other countries have done something similar. Unfortunately, not the countries which will need this material most, and which are developing countries and have very high tariffs. But I think the merit of a plurilateral initiative would be to really look at strengthening the resilience of supply chains by having a plurilateral agreement involving as many countries as possible. Because, as I said, we see already in the policy discourse now in many countries a focus on reshoring, bringing production home, etc., which is not feasible and extremely expensive. But if we want to counter that narrative, we have to recognize that diversified supply chains are more resilient than supply chains which depend on just a few countries of sourcing. And I think that would be the charm of a plurilateral initiative. You look at export and import, and you look at actually enhancing the conditions for the production of material, which unfortunately we are likely to need more in the future. Because yes, I mean, the last pandemic that is halfway comparable was the Spanish flu 100 years ago. But with climate change, there are lots of scientists who say pandemics are likely to become more frequent in these conditions. So I think there is probably a political momentum now that we should exploit, and that certainly from the EU side, we are keen to explore. And indeed, we would not do that on our own. We would do that with a group of other countries, just like we did for the interim arrangement to compensate the disappearance of the appellate body, the multi-party interim arrangement, which we promoted, and where we ended up with quite a good group of countries supporting that. And I think that is a model that we could see being used also in this context.
If I could jump in with just a thought, and that is international cooperation is necessary to bolster the production side, as Sabina said. It's also necessary to deal with allocation of scarcity. And that will extend into areas that are not traditional for the WTO, but members may want to bring them there because they have effects on trade. And these include preemptive purchasing, sort of the opposite of the government procurement code, as well as bidding up prices. A problem within the United States that Governor Cuomo cites is state governments bidding against each other and bidding up supplies, but they're also bidding with against other countries. So the market has not proved to be perfect with respect to allocation of highly limited supplies of absolutely crucial goods. And should that be a subject of conversation? Absolutely. So it's a broad range of, we need transparency. We have a place to discuss these things, but we need more than transparency now. We certainly need more than the existing rules. The existing rules are designed to give flexibility to members to do what they need to do in emergencies. But they really do not have near-term limits. They would have limits down the road in terms of a dispute that might be brought, but the answer won't come in for a year or two. And that's not good enough. We need answers that are more prompt and effective.
Thank you, Alan. I'm going to come back to Sabine again, sort of playing off a few of the comments that were raised and sort of alluded to indirectly. The US has already done one very large stimulus initiative and is in very active discussions on another one. How do you see that having an impact on discussions in the EU, where the member states are discussing a much programs not as large as what the US is contemplating? And then it dovetails into questions about the subsidies question with the Boeing Airbus dispute and bilateral discussions between the US and the EU. So I guess it's a two-part question. One, reflect the disparity in assistance that the governments are doing and how that may impact on trade and the competitiveness of US companies versus European companies if the US continues to write more and more checks and more debt to address the crisis. And then the second part of the question is update on the status of US-EU discussions, both in bilateral discussions.
Well, that's a very complex question, obviously. But I mean, if I look at what we are doing in Europe at the moment, then so the member states and also the EU have pulled out all the stops in order to make sure that we avoid that otherwise healthy companies go bankrupt and that workers and employees are laid off simply because through the lockdown, the economy has come to a halt. So I think this is a crisis, as I said, wartime economic effort in a way to maintain the economic and social fabric of our societies. The real question will be, at what stage does that morph into distortive subsidies for production in order to compete on an unfair basis with other companies? We are not there yet. Yeah. We might get there, but I hope that as like-minded countries, we will be able, together with the US and Japan, with whom we have already in the past made statements about the importance of market-oriented conditions, that we can make a coordinated effort to also get out of the necessary subsidization that we will see. And let's also keep in mind, we are not just, it's not just the EU and the US we are talking about here. We have Asia, and in particular China, which is coming out of the crisis earlier because they got into the crisis earlier. And they will be able to subsidize and support a lot of production, etc. So I think from that point of view, I would assume that just like until now, before the crisis, there is a joint interest of market economies to make sure that we do not kill the market that we will need in order to get out of the crisis. But it will require a very careful monitoring. But at this stage, when I look at where the money currently goes, at least in Europe, it is really to maintain people in employment, essentially. That is also what we are doing with our short work program at European level, with which we are pouring a lot of money. And obviously, the support in the US takes a different form, because they do not have the same system of automatic stabilizers, of social security, of unemployment support that we have in the EU. And I think we have to recognize that. So for me, this is again another case where we need to have cooperation between major players, and in particular between the market economies on this globe.
Coming back, Alan, this is, it's been certainly a goal of the Trump administration to have more onshoring of US manufacturing. Do you see one of the outcomes of this crisis as shortening of supply chains and more onshoring, certainly of medical equipment, but in other areas as well, and for the long-term trade flows?
It seems to me we're on something of a knife edge between emphasis on international cooperation, which is one direction, and emphasis on greater self-sufficiency. There are limits, obviously, to, especially in a crisis like this one, to immediate self-sufficiency. And longer term, there are high costs to excessive self-sufficiency, because if it's practiced by many, then it can be very self-defeating. But will there be some onshoring? Presumably, or nearshoring? There is a North American free trade agreement. When the oil embargoes occurred in the 1970s, there was an immediate look at where else are there dependencies, in that case, on raw materials, and where could there be carbonization, and how vulnerable was, in that case, the United States. I'm sure that there will be a domestic debate in many countries as to the degree that they can rely on foreign supplies, and to the extent that there is a proliferation of export controls, that's going to drive onshoring, not just in the United States, but in many locations, and we'll have a poorer world. It's simple as that. There will be less employment. There will be less growth in, if any, in global GDP. So the equation's complex, but it's interrelated. And what one country does, or several countries do, that will have ramifications. So that's why getting back to Geneva for some very serious discussions. And these things aren't going to be done largely in a big room. They're done in smaller rooms when ambassadors want to get together, or ministers, and think through how they could advance particular proposals and come to some conclusions. That's the next stage. And there are actually tremendous opportunities in this crisis to do a better job. And I think we'll get there.
I wish, Alan, that we could offer our Zoom platform for all these countries to be able to get together. I know that not having the chance to have these kinds of conversations quietly with one another in person is going to create more difficulties. We're running out of time. I don't want to keep people beyond the appointed time, but I did want to see, Sabine, there was a couple different questions that came in about food security, and you mentioned it in your talk. We also have Darcy here as one of the leading agricultural and food security negotiators the United States has had. Is there anything, are you hearing any worrying signs or anything that we should be doing to facilitate agri-food trade in this time of crisis? Anything that we can be doing that we haven't already discussed on the call?
I can jump in briefly. I think in 2008, the FAO, the WTO, and others really played a great role in terms of sharing data about food supplies in general, and where there was a feeling about a price crisis and supply concerns, they helped to alleviate that. And Alan mentioned already the fact that we have huge stocks of cereals. We're actually at a great time of surplus at the moment, but those complicated supply chains that we talked about earlier are what have been interrupted. And so there is ample food. It has not, with the same regularity, gotten to grocery store shelves and created that impression of shortage. And so I think, to the extent we can, for everyday citizens, help to clarify that, in fact, your eggs may not be in the grocery store this week, but they will be there next week. That it is not a supply crisis, and that governments can continue to coordinate when it comes to availability of shipping vessels and containers and how food can move in a more orderly fashion. That transparency about the system, I think, can take some of the pressure away from governments feeling they need to take measures that ultimately could lead to pockets of shortage, to price increases, and things that would exacerbate the current situation for people who are already facing health challenges. So again, I think the system's role in transparency and data and good coordination of information remains really critical.
Thank you, Darcy, and if I may, we had a lot of other questions, and I apologize to our people watching that we weren't able to get to all of those. I want to give Sabine and Alan a chance to say any last comments, reference to any of the other questions that were asked before, or any other comments on what was said by the panelists, and then Wendy, a final word to close out the session. Sabine?
Thank you very much. Telegraphically, because I read some of the questions in the question and answer function, and I also wanted to pick up on what Alan said about the trend towards reshoring or nearshoring. I really think that it would be good to try and steer this into the direction of diversification. Because if we have crises or pandemics which strike at different moments, different parts of the world, it's only through diversification that you can address these, and not through simple nearshoring. There's something that we can do as public authorities to set the framework through multilateral, plurilateral, and bilateral trade rules, through our FTAs, for instance. We are trying to do that. There will also be an enormous pressure on the private sector to improve their risk management, because people are now wondering how it comes that countries relied on a single source of supply. And then, when that source was not available because China had to close down, then we saw effects around the globe. So I think there will also be an enormous pressure on business to improve their risk management. And the more they are able to do that and to show that they have resilient supply chains, the less governments will have to interfere with the allocation of investments and the direction of trading streams. So I think that is a very important element. One word I also wanted to say there, because I saw there was a couple of questions on the transatlantic relationship. There is a live ongoing discussion between Commissioner Hogan and Ambassador Lighthizer, both addressed at trying to deal with notably the Airbus-Boeing issue, but also still trying to see how we can build a positive agenda and get rid of the punitive tariffs that the US has imposed. And I think here I want to basically wheel back to the agri-food sector. It makes no sense that in the context of the Airbus tariffs, the US hits agricultural exports from the EU with tariffs, with additional tariffs. It only hits then American consumers, but also agri-food producers in the EU. That really doesn't make any sense. So I think from that point of view, this crisis urges us to have a fresh look at policy measures that were taken before, and it reinforces the need to get rid of trade restrictive measures. But our discussions with the US are ongoing, just like we are also continuing the trilateral discussions with the US and Japan to take forward the work on industrial subsidies and on level playing field issues more generally. Now, obviously, at the moment, there is no bandwidth at a high political level to decisively deal with that. But we keep the discussions going so that we are ready when the political attention turns back to these issues, that things will have been prepared properly. Thank you very much. I think it was a very interesting discussion, and you know, if there's also an advantage in this lockdown, because these sort of video conferencing is a lot less burdensome than having to travel around the globe, and it does allow still exchanges. So I, for one, appreciated this very much. Thank you very much.
Just wrapping up, coming back to emergency actions, the trading system has to be more responsive. It has not had, of course, a pandemic during the course of its existence since the multilateral trading system came into being in 47. The last one of this kind was 1918. So there are a whole range of issues that have to be dealt with. We talked about tariffs, we talked about export restrictions, but also product standards, making sure that goods meet standards, international standards, but also that they can get across borders quickly and easily. And that takes a great deal more cooperation. It's true for manufactured goods. It's also true for, of course, food products and food. The longer term, what we haven't talked about is trade finance. After 2008, 2009, trade finance did not come back to the extent it existed before the financial crisis. And trade moves with finance. So the multilateral, the WTO has in the past coordinated with the multilateral financial institutions, the fund, the World Bank and the regional development banks, as well as the large major commercial banks, to rebuild the connections, because without trade finance, particularly in the developing countries, there will be no exports to them, there'll be no exports from them that require finance, and it isn't there. And countries are going to be strained, financial systems are going to be strained, and there has to be room made for how the world trading system is going to rebound. And that's going to require attention to trade finance. So it's just another element that is going to be imperative. But I thank you for this session and for the work you do, and for the great comments from Darcy and Sabina and Wendy. Thank you very much.
Wendy, any final words?
Yes, and just to be quick, I think Alan just raises a good point. We haven't talked about trade finance. We've, you know, in our past sessions, we've really focused on tariffs and export restraints. But let's also keep in mind there's trade facilitation, subsidies came up today, standards are very important here. We haven't discussed intellectual property or digital trade, but both of these issue areas are also very relevant to this discussion. So I guess it's just a way of saying, I think we have a lot work to do, and we're going to be busy for a lot of Thursdays. And I just really want to thank the panelists and our great moderator, Darcy, very close colleague. I thought this was a great discussion. And for me personally, if I'm asked for an update next week or the week after, whenever, I can't wait till I have good news to report to everyone from developments around the world, both on the health side, but on the economic side.
Thank you, Darcy. Thank you, Darcy. Any final words that you want to make?
Just a thank you to the panelists and for the opportunity to join today. I enjoyed this discussion very much.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Thanks, Darcy, for joining us on this one. Wendy, my partner in these sessions we've been doing. Thank you. Sabine, it's a pleasure to have had a chance to meet you virtually. While, yes, I agree, these have created a great opportunity for us to continue a dialogue across the Atlantic and around the world virtually. We do look forward to the chance to host you in Washington. That is what WITA does. We are a convening function. We bring people together. And I think a lot of at our in-person events, a lot of the discussion that takes place in the aisles with people outside the room and inside the room is where a lot of people get value out of our public events, which Alan knows well. And Alan, thank you again. I'm incredibly grateful to you as always for many years, and just in this time where there's so much uncertainty, having your steady hand at the WTO is one I know that gives a lot of peace to those of us who are concerned about the future direction of international trade. So we're very grateful for you for everything you do there today. With that, we're going to close the session. We look forward to seeing everyone again here next week when we'll be talking about some of the export restraints. You'll see more information about that coming in your inboxes in the hopefully in the day to come. Thank you again, Wendy, Sabine, Darcy, and Alan for joining us, and we look forward to seeing everybody again soon. Thank you.